will begin today where we left off, of course, last week. And get my notes here. I think we ended off, yes. We were looking at the worship and priesthood in the content section of 1 Chronicles. And we ended with this slide, and we were wondering how important the genealogies in 1 Chronicles 6 would have been to you. If you just turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, just wanted to point out that the genealogies don't have to be boring. They can help us in our biblical interest and in our faith. We ourselves now have studied through time now, beginning with the creation, till the release of Israel's captivity. And if you look at chapter 6 and verse 1, for instance, in verse 1, there's a name mentioned here which should ring a bell to us. Maybe I'll begin. Jeremy, I'll get you to read verse 1 for us. Please.
The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari.
I thought I'd start with you with the tough words. But there's a name in there that should ring a bell. The name was mentioned last week. Actually, Jeremy mentioned it. You spot a name there that seems familiar?
Well, there's two, but
is there two?
It's Levi.
Oh, yeah, okay. Other than Levi.
Okay.
Is there another one there that jumps out at you? Jeremy used it last week.
Gershon?
Next one.
Kohath?
Kohath, yeah. If you turn over to Numbers chapter 7 and verse 9, I'll ask you, what was that family's duties?
Carrying the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, that's actually where the name come up last week. Jeremy spoke of that. If you look at Numbers 7 and verse 9, Gord, I'll get you to read that. Numbers chapter 7 and verse 9. Well,
yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
But to the sons of Kohath he gave none, because they were charged with the service of the holy things that had to be carried on the shoulders.
That's where we mentioned that name last week. Remember when we were speaking of carrying the ark? It was the sons of Kohath that were to carry that. That's kind of interesting. That reaffirms to us. And if you look at verse 2, back in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, you look at verse 2, who was Kohath's first son there?
Amram.
Right, Jeff, Amram. Why would he be important? Look at verse 3.
Aaron and Moses.
Right, right. Amram was the father of Aaron. And if you remember, the line of Aaron in particular is recorded down in verse 49 to 53, and also in chapter 9, verses 10 to 3. And if you look at verse 48, back in chapter 6, we see there that those verses give the duties of Aaron's sons and daughters, and her sons and grandsons. And I'm trying to find my spot here. Aaron, Moses, and Miriam are named afterwards, after this. They're named only, but after that, only Aaron's sons are mentioned. And we see in verse 40, I might put down the wrong verse. Verse 50. These are the sons of Aaron. Eleazar his son, Phinehas his son, Abishua his sons. Now I found it interesting. Nadab and Abihu aren't mentioned there. What happened to them?
Well, there's a couple things I could say. Is first of all, they were killed.
Right.
But second of all, appears to me that there is sort of a, like you see in other genealogies, a condensing
Right.
of the genealogies. Eleazar could, like as far as Phineas, seems to me to be Eli's son. Because that was what Eli's son was, and Eleazar may be Eli, it may be
Right.
another son. When we go through the Old Testament, in certain places, even in the New Testament, we're going to see a condensing.
Yes.
Son is not used like the same way we use son. It means offspring.
Right.
And so in Matthew, when we read the genealogies of Jesus, some of the kings of Israel or of Judah are missing. And so, and that's the problem when you go back and try to date all of these happenings. Is, do we have a complete genealogy, or has it been condensed?
Right.
And in certain places we see that it's been condensed. It doesn't contradict anything that we've read, because the Jews counted genealogies different.
Right.
It was important. These were in the past. It would be important that they be able to follow all the way through.
Right, right. As for Aaron's sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, they were the ones that continued the high priestly line. And of course, we don't see Nadab and Abihu there. They were killed for offering forbidden fire to the Lord. And also in the beginning of this genealogy, there's a record of the duties of the Levites and the priests. That's in chapter 9, and also from chapter 23 to 26. And also recorded in here is the cities, which, if you remember, were appointed for the habitation of the Levites. Remember, they had their own cities. And they're also recorded. And the reason for that was, now that they're out of bondage, they're going back home, they need to receive their rightful places of dwelling. Just the same as the genealogies here of the priests and of the tribes. There was all a reason for this. This was needed for Israel. And so the narrative of 1 Chronicles begins with the end of Israel's first king. Remember, King Saul. And from the smallest tribe in Israel, and also the smallest family in the tribe of Benjamin, came Saul. You might say from rags to riches is what Saul came from. And then if we look over at 1 Chronicles chapter 10, 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 1 to 14 there speak of the conclusion of Saul's reign. And we know the story well. Remember, Saul was in battle with the Philistines, and Saul was wounded, and he asked his arm bearer to kill him. And we read down in verses 13 and 14. Remember, Saul now and his sons have been killed. And we read, so Saul died. Okay? And now we're told why he died. For his trespass which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep. And also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him, and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. There's a lesson there, isn't there, for us in the end of Saul's life, isn't there? We read of his death there, and we read of why God allowed that to happen. And then we move to the inauguration of Israel's next king. And after this point, Chronicles now follows the story of David's arrangement for Israel's worship, which was conducted, of course, now by the Levitical priests. And so next now, in
You have the clicker up there.
oh, is it up here? Oh, okay. Is it on?
It should be.
Is it? Oh, yeah. Okay, next in our content of First Chronicles, we want to look at David's preparation for the temple. And to begin this thought, we're asked the question, what aspect of David's life is emphasized in First Chronicles? And what does this reveal about his character? Actually, this question really should say aspects of David's life, because I read quite a few in there. But first off, as we already have pointed out, the writer of Chronicles makes no mention of the part of David's life that most people always think about. And that was his adultery with Bathsheba. Remember the rape of his daughter Tamar by her half-brother Amnon. Remember Absalom, the rebellion of his first son Absalom. And I found that interesting. There's no mention of that. And so what then does the writer of Chronicles focus on the life of David? Is there anything that jumps out to you about David? I could begin with my first point, and then might bring some thoughts to you. But in the beginning, David captures Jerusalem, in which the temple will be built. We read that in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, 4-9. We read there, then David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, and the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, were there. See, Jerusalem now is overtaken by foreigners, the Jebusites. And they treat David, they mock David, don't they? In verse 2, we read there where he's told that you won't enter here. But then we read, nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion. And we read in verse 6 and 7 how they've done that. And then David overtakes Jerusalem. But what does that say about his character, do you think? Does it say anything to you about his character? We kind of got to put ourselves in David's shoes here. What would you think? Does that not say he's courageous?
It's courageous and he also trusts and believes in God.
Right, exactly. Verse 9, James, read verse 9 of chapter 11.
Chapter 11?
Yes, First Chronicles 11. Chapter 11 and verse 9.
And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him.
Okay, that's it. So David knew that, didn't he? He didn't worry. He didn't worry about the Jebusites mocking him. He was courageous. God will do this. So he had courage and trust in God. Is there anything, any other events there that you could think of? Jeremy?
Preparations to build the temple. He was told he couldn't build the temple. He wasn't going to be allowed by God, but that doesn't mean he didn't prepare. And he prepared, and he charged his son Solomon, "You're going to build this temple." He brought the ark there. That was the purpose. He brought it to Jerusalem. He didn't bring it there just because on a whim. He knew that he was going to build, or at least the temple of the Lord would be built there. And that was his goal, was to be able to worship God in the temple, or at least the children of Israel to be able to do that. And he never saw it, but the children after him did.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, we'll touch on that. Sneak in the point now, because Jeremy mentioned, remember, David's heart's desire was he wanted to build that temple. Didn't he? That he wanted to do that for God. And then God told him, no, you can't build it. And I thought to myself, I'm surprised then is how David handled that. He didn't pout, whine, and forsake God. He moved on, and we see what his efforts were in the preparation for the building of that. And that says something about his character. George?
I was going to say that it's a good example for us. Just because our hearts desire something doesn't mean it's going to happen or we should try to force it to happen. Things happen at the right time.
Right.
And, you know, sometimes we do lose faith in hope like that because we take it personally.
Exactly. And we never seem to move on from there, do we, sometimes, which isn't good. But Jeremy mentioned the Ark of the Covenant, and in 1 Chronicles 13, verses 1 to 4, I thought was interesting. Verses 1 to 4, then David consulted with the captains of the thousands and the hundreds, even with every leader. David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is from the Lord our God, let us send everywhere to our kinsmen who remain in all the land of Israel, also to the priests and Levites who are with them in their cities with their pasture lands, that they may meet with us, and let us bring the ark of our God to us. For we did not seek it in the days of Saul. Then all the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of the people. What do we learn? We learned something here about David as a king, as a leader, and we've already discussed the tragedy of this story. We know the sin, but we know that they handled the situation wrong. But we learned something here, I think, from David as a leader, as a king. Do you see something jump out? He's got a decision to make. And what's he do? Right, James, right. Now we see in verse 4, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Now that can go negative into the positive, can it? And in this story, the people not only forgot, David forgot, and no one consulted God. But the point that I saw and that James made, we just remind ourselves, let's seek out righteous advisement, encouragement, advice. There's nothing wrong with that.
And you see, David learned his lesson. He inquired of God later. He didn't go out and just build the temple.
No.
He learned his lesson from this.
Right.
And when on religious matters, he was consulting God, and even on other matters he did too. He learned his lesson that to trust in God, and that was a good lesson for him to learn.
Right. We saw that in chapter 15, in the first 4 verses of that chapter, and then in verses 11 and 15. As Jeremy said, we saw there David now as a humble man. He admits his fault. He makes the correction. And then he lets the people know. As a king, that's a courageous. Colin and Jeff?
But in verse 2 it says, David said to all the assembly of Israel, it is good, if it is good to you, and if it is from the Lord our God, let us send everywhere to our kinsmen who remain in all the land of Israel, and also to the priests and Levites and so on. But he did say, if it is the Lord's will.
Right, but they never followed through, did he? But
that was his intention. He did.
Well, that's true.
Yeah,
that's exactly. But what I see there is we can begin on the right track. We can get sidestepped.
And everybody agreed, that seems right. So, because it did mention the Lord.
Right. James?
The question was asked last week, not after that. David was the king, and he was the one responsible
Yes.
for Uzzah's death. But on checking here, we can see that David was misinformed, because he said, if it was from the Lord, he to see if it's, so you have all the people together. People should be giving advice to the king. As a leader, you have to take advice from the commanders. You're not the one in the field. So you have to take advice, and they should know the law. And if you consult the Levites and the priests, they should have given you the right advice. So the blame cannot be put on him.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. There's those that would say too, David should have known. But what I take out of the story, and without maybe pinpointing exactly the blame, it was all David's blame, was that David learned, found out the mistake, found out how he had sinned, and he made the correction. Although Uzzah paid the price for that sin.
I was going to leap onto Call's point before Jeff.
Okay.
Just because we say something is the Lord's will and it comes to pass,
right,
doesn't make it the Lord's will, and that's a lesson that we need to learn. We say, well, the Lord willing, I will do this or I will do that, and then we do it. We have assumed that, okay, it was the Lord's will. Some things are the Lord's will. I'm not going to deny that.
Right.
But some things the Lord is neither willing or unwilling. Like as far as he's not made, like we think God makes every choice for us. God doesn't make every choice for us. There are some things he wills and some things he doesn't will. But then there's that middle where he just allows time and chance to occur. That's what Ecclesiastes says. And so David here says, if the Lord will. But God used this as a lesson to teach them about following his will. Right. And just because he allowed the ark to initially be moved on the ox cart didn't mean that's how God approved it.
Right.
And so when we say the Lord wills, we need to recognize we're asking that the Lord will it. We're asking that it become God's will. And sometimes God will say yes, sometimes he'll say no, and just sometimes he won't say anything.
Right.
And let's never assume that just because something happened, that the Lord will it.
No. And in this case, David found out it wasn't from the Lord.
No.
He presumed. Jeff?
I think Will pretty much hit on the correct part of this. It's good to make the separation. There's two parts to this.
All right.
What you have pointed out about David is correct. He consulted other captains. He consulted captains. He should have consulted. That's right.
Right.
It's good to consult others about what to do. He knew that the ark had a purpose, according to verse 3. The ark was supposed to be with God's people. He knew that. It was never God's intention that the ark be separated from his people.
Right.
It became separated because they did wrong. It was God's will that the ark be with them, and it should have been with them. One mistake after all these things, he knew the correct thing that needed to be done. He made sure that everybody was on board, that they agreed that this needed to be done. They knew it was God's will to be done. The way they went about it was wrong. That was the actual wrong part. The way they physically actually tried to move that ark was wrong. So yeah, we can know what God wants to do, but like others have already stated, we can go about that in a wrong way. Whoever's fault that is, well, David would have to, of course, take blame. He's the king.
Well, I agree.
Right.
Yes.
And of course, others are going to share in that blame for not speaking up, like the Levites.
Right.
If they are the sons of Kohath, should they not say, we're supposed to carry that stuff? Somebody could have said something.
Exactly. And no one, nobody did. But you're right, David was king. He was in that position of leading.
And leaders take the blame. Sometimes, and they're supposed to. Like when something goes wrong, there might be blame that goes around. I'm not saying that David should take all the blame. There is blame to go around, but the leader, it is ultimately the leader's responsibility to make the final decision. When it comes to the church, and the church has elders, the elders are to shepherd the flock. Now, good shepherds will consult their flock in their leadership. but they're the ultimate ones to make the decisions. They're going to be responsible for those decisions. If something goes right, too often they don't get the credit, and they should. And when something goes wrong, they'll take part of the blame. Others will be to blame too. I'm not saying that.
Mhm.
But if you take a leadership role, you need to take some. You will have some of the responsibility of fulfilling your duties in that leadership role.
Exactly. There's a whole lesson on parallels, isn't there, here with David and leaders. And all good for us to think about. And so also, I saw in 1 Chronicles here, David's desire to build the temple. That speaks of his character, doesn't it? His heart's desire was to have God with Israel, to have his temple. In chapter 21 and verse 22, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth of this later on, but we see here that David purchases the site on which the temple would be built. And I'm trying to not get into too much thought on this question, because we are going to go into it in depth, but we just see here his character. David, there was a lot of guilt at that point here, a lot of fear in David at this point of that story. But we see there, he wants this land. God has inspired him, if you will, to secure this piece of land. And David goes out and does that. And also along the same thoughts of that is David's contribution of his own wealth to the construction of the temple. We see that in chapter 29. And what does that say about his attitude to you? He's been told now he can't build it. And as we mentioned, when Gord made the thought, he didn't pout about it. He didn't turn against everyone because he couldn't fulfill his dream of building the temple for God. And so what do we see him doing here? Yeah, he gives of his own money, of his own gold, his own silver. What's that say about his attitude? He just moves on, doesn't he? Okay, the Lord's told me that I can't build it. Well, here's what I can do. And he moves on, and he does that. And he does it in a generous way, doesn't he? He gives a lot of his own wealth. And then we see in chapter 22 and 28, David's charge to Solomon, regarding his responsibilities to build the temple. As a father, he, did I get the wrong chapter?
22?
6 to 9?
No, 6 to 9, you were saying about 28.
Oh, 28, 1 to 21, I think that.
Oh, I thought you were saying verse 28.
Oh, no, sorry. No, chapter 28. I didn't want to read them all. They're kind of lengthy. We'll never get through this lesson here. And then we see something else. David's preparation for the worship and operation of the temple, first to the Levites for the maintaining of the temple, the appointment of the priests for their work of service in the temple. These are in chapter 23, chapter 24, and 26. He makes the appointment of singers and the musicians to their work concerning the worship associated with the temple, and even to the point of the gatekeepers of the temple. David is making sure everyone knows their duties, their position. He is leaving no one in the dark. This is how God wants it, and this is how we must do it. And I just thought sometimes, when we're looking ahead to future plans, David's looking ahead here to the building of the temple, Solomon building it, the excitement of it. sometimes we can begin to slack off on our personal responsibilities at the time. Sometimes we always look ahead for bigger and better, and then we overlook, don't we, as humans? But not so with David. We see before the plans of the temple, as I worded it, kicked into high gear. We see his attitude, remember, for the tabernacle, for the ark, remember, in the tent. That's still there. That's still the point of worship. And his attitude for the maintenance of that regular worship before the ark and the tabernacle is all recorded in chapter 16. And we read there in verse 37, every day's work, what every day's work required. There's such a parallel here to me between us as Christians and this. We don't have the temple duties. We don't have the burnt offerings. But we have responsibilities as Christians. It's not only on the first day of the week, is it?
And this goes back maybe to your earlier point about what the book of 1 Chronicles' purpose was. Giving these examples of how David did this is going to be an example of how the future temple, when it's finally rebuilt and done, they're going to need to know, all right, what are the responsibilities of the priests? What are and these are stories. Okay, this is how it was done in the past. We need to replicate how it was done in the past, and giving this story of a king that set this up really does go to the point of the overall arching of the Levites, as far as to know what are my responsibilities, rather than just being told. Examples sometimes are important too. This is how they did it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And he makes mention there of every part. The burnt offerings for the service every morning, every evening. In verse 41 of chapter 16, he makes mention of those who offered the giving of thankful prayer. Everyone had a duty with the Levites, even to those who blew the trumpets and cymbals. And we need to remind ourselves of David's expressions also of praise and thanksgiving to God that are recorded in this book. After he brought the ark back home to Jerusalem, if you're in 1 Chronicles 16, verses 7 to 36, I just summed up some of David's thoughts with some emphasis there. David, seek the Lord. He imposed that, reminded the people. Sing, proclaim, declare his wonders, David said to them. His thoughts on giving, give, bring to the Lord. And then one of a humbling thought, tremble before the Lord. And I found this one interesting. Rejoice, for he is coming to judge the earth, David said. Save us, David said. Gather us, deliver us, and finally, blessed be the Lord God. Sums up that passage. David, as God said, he was a man after his own heart. David was. But as we know, that did not mean that David could not be overcome by Satan and his deceiving powers, though. But his heart's desire was for God. And having said that, our question was, how does the tragic story of David's census relate to his preparation for building the temple? If you look over in 1 Chronicles 21, 1 Chronicles 21, and I thought I'd clear up something right at the beginning of this chapter, because I read here in verse 1, where do I get the right chapter? Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. Well, I look back in 2 Samuel 24 and verse 1 of the parallel passage, and back there it said that the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he moved David. And then in Chronicles it says Satan stood up against Israel and moved David. I thought, well, that might be confusing, and it's not difficult to explain. First, we need to remember what James 1 and verse 13 says. Okay, James 1 and verse 13. What are we told? What does James tell us? Right. God doesn't tempt man, does he? God does not tempt man. But he allows it to happen, doesn't he? He permits it. Think of Job, right? Satan sought to tempt Job, and God granted Satan that wish, but of course there was a stipulation in there too. And remember Peter, the Apostle Peter, what Jesus said to him in Luke 22 and 31, that Satan desires to sift you as wheat. So the Lord allowed some adversary or Satan to tempt David. And here in our passage it is said that God allowed that. And whatever the case, though whether it was an adversary or Satan, because there's some thoughts on that, but whatever the case, though, God's grace is at work here. We see God's grace in that he sent a way of escape for David, though, didn't he? And that escape came through the advice of a man who really had no great faith in the Lord, did he? But he knew that what David was doing was wrong. And that man was David's general of his army, Joab. Remember Joab from our last study. Joab certainly wasn't God-fearing. Joab was out for what was good for Joab. But we see here that he suggested to David and told him that was wrong, but we see David didn't heed that advice. And now there's all, I guess we're going to have to, 2 minutes, okay. There's all kinds of opinions now on why David decided to number Israel. But the most reasonable that I thought, what was your thought? Why did David number Israel in that story? Did you come to a consensus of why he did that? And we'll read what we do know. I think just pride. That was my thought. There's a whole list of thoughts, but we don't read anything there in that story of why. The only thought I could come to was for pride, David. It seems that he numbered all the men that could battle, that could take the sword. But what we do know is found in verse 8. And David now is speaking to God. David says, I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing. But now please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. So whatever the reason, it was pride, whatever our opinions are, David answers the base of this story. He sinned for doing that. And it comes directly from his mouth. And then so, with I guess the time's just about out, it is out, we'll pick up then with a few more thoughts on this question next week then.